Qin Xa, the master of the Keshig, the first captain of the White Scars Legion. This character was a beacon of hope and a symbol of what the legions were before the time of the Horus Heresy. However, the paint scheme turned out a little bit darker than I anticipated. Everything I paint at the moment feels like a time capsule, just a reflection of 2020, which hasn't been a great year for anybody. Let's see how my mood influences this piece. We begin, as ever, with a undercoat of Scale 75's Black Primer. I would also recommend using Steinel Res Primer, the black primer from Badger. Both excellent paints. And then, once that's completely dry, we use Medea.com Art Opaque White to add a zenithal highlight. But it's a little bit more than a zenithal highlight. We want to define the lines and volumes of the piece. So we're trying to give dynamic transitions across the entirety of the miniature and sketch a black and white overall impression of the miniature. The airbrush is at a slightly higher PSI than normal. I've decided to go up to 30 as an experiment, slowly edging my way up. I found this comfortable, found this easy to use, so I'm using a 30 PSI throughout this tutorial. And I will be not thinning the paint whatsoever. The Medea.com Art stuff, you need a tiny amount in the airbrush already to help lubricate the system, but it's not thinned down at all. It's straight out of the pot. Okay, the white armor. I appreciate white is a struggle. It's not the easiest of colors to paint because the purer the white, the more it reflects ambient surroundings. So in effect, if we set a miniature with a strong sunset behind it, most of the armor would have sunset hues of orange and blue, orange and yellow, and maybe it's a little bit of purple in the edges. But if you painted your miniature in orange and blues, well, you'd have all sorts of comments. So for this, we're going for a pretty middle-of-the-road white. So relying on the old recipe of using a warm base coat with cool shadows. To begin this process, we use Walnut by Scale 75, and this is thinned down roughly in the ratio of 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. When using the airbrush, we don't want to give a one coat coverage. You can see very clearly the undercoat poking through. We still retain that structure of the black and white. Now, this stage looks a lot easier than it may appear at first, because getting the pre-shading technique, it's difficult. It takes technique, it takes practice to develop it. So if you're unsure, if this is the first video you're watching, or if you don't know how to construct a pre-coat technique, simply take white into an airbrush, add a zenithal highlight, and build up in very thin, gradual glazes. Thinner paint is always better when you begin to get a handle of the consistencies. Next up, we use birch to add around 90% of a highlight to the volumes of the piece. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the walnut only stays in roughly 10% of the shadows that we've established with our pre-coat layer. The pre-coat layer allows us to do a lot of things. We can sketch in tones, we can correct mistakes, we can play around with the form of the miniature. If we make any mistakes in the initial stage, we can correct it here. However, I felt very good with my initial base coat, my initial pre-coat, so I've built on top of birch. Now, birch is a warm ivory colour. It's made with a combination of brown, yellow and white. You can make up your own if you wanted to, or any other ivory or light skull colour will serve you well here. This is airbrushed in 2 thin layers, gradually blending it from the top highlight right the way through to the lower mid-tone. Again, if we split a paint job up into 5 parts, highlight, upper mid-tone, mid-tone, lower mid-tone, shadow, this covers the highlight all the way through down to the lower mid-tone. Okay, I've sneakily snuck in a hairdryer there. It's the tool you will use the most. Okay, here is we're using the car here, which is a light ivory colour with a slight green tinge to it. So in order to give a dramatic look to your white, we not only need to think in terms of black and white in terms of value scale, but also in terms of warm and cool hues. We've used warm colours as a base tone, and on top of this we can add a cool highlight. We can also apply a cool colour in the shadow. So not only are we thinking in terms of value, black to white, light to dark, but also in terms of warm to cool. And this will give a much, much more satisfying overall impression at the end. Okay, opaque white is then added. Oh, sorry, the Nacre again is at a scale of 2:1, and so was the birch. So 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. The Scale 75 paints, they thin down very easily. They're gel based, and they do run out the airbrush very, very swiftly. If you were using a Games Workshop paint, let me get my words out, you would need to add more additional thinner to this. The same with the Vallejo model color range, and it's a different quantity again with the Vallejo air range. Finding that bite, finding that correct consistency does come with experience, but as a rough rule of thumb, slightly over thin your paints. You can always build it up later. You can always build it up in layers. The previous layer of the white goes over the upper mid-tone through to the highlight to really define those top notes of the highlight, and that's it. That's all I want to do for the highlight. Coal black is mixed with thinner, so this is airbrush thinner, and I use life color thinner, acrylic thinner, and this is thinned down 1 part paint to 4 parts thinner. It is an incredibly thin glaze consistency. If you're looking for a correlation, if you're looking for if you're looking for a paint that's similar, have a look at Games Workshop's washes range, and it's the same kind of opacity. Now, working with paints this thin, it's very easy for them to pool in areas. So light touches here. You can see my motion with the airbrush. It's light, feathery trigger motions to just spurt paint here and there. I'm not really pulling back on the trigger that much. There's very little amount of paint coming. It's a soft feather transition at this stage. Again, this will come with practice. This will come with experience, I promise you. And we can imitate this. So if you don't quite get this technique, the brushwork will cover a multitude of sins. The airbrush should only be thought of as a rough base coating tool. The brush and oil work, especially the oil blending I'll show you later on, hoo boy, it will show you a whole new world. Constructing a palette. Now, this is a question I get quite often on how exactly do you go about choosing the colours for a project. Well, with this piece, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to achieve. I knew roughly the kind of colour palette I had in mind from previous work I've done. So the red, for example, I wanted more brown in the mixture to give it a more leathery, earthen tone. The white, I knew I wanted to have notes of blue and green in there. The skin tone from the Mongol bust, I knew I wanted more leathery notes in there. So this is how I started constructing my colour scheme, my colour palette. We start off with... Hold on, I got my notes. Bloodfest Crimson from Scale 75, which is quite a low value but very intense red. It's quite saturated. Sanguine Base from Formula P3, and Wood Grain. Now these 3 colours, they closely resemble one another, so they're largely interchangeable how I'll be using them going forward. Then onto the palette, Sol Yellow and Nacre. Nacre to imitate or mimic what we've done previously. Sol Yellow because it's always good to have a bright primary yellow on your palette. Always try and have the primary colours on your palette. Yellow, blue, red, or if you're using the updated one, I normally put both of them on, turquoise, magenta, yellow. Okay, Walnut also makes an appearance on the base, onto the palette rather, as well as Art Black and Art White. Because you need this for contrast, you need to mix into other colours to up or decrease the value. And value is the scale from black to white. So the lower the value, the blacker it is, the higher the value, the lighter it is. Pink Flesh is added because I knew it would pair well with the reds that I have on there. I can highlight the reds with Pink Flesh, and it would also allow me to put down a satisfying base tone for the skin. Golden Skin. always a classic because the skin tone has a high value, so it's lighter, and it has yellow in there. So when it comes to highlighter, we don't need to add so much sol yellow in there. And again, it highlights red beautifully. Crimson, because you need some red in there. And this is the Scale 75 Artist paint. Any of the tubes that you see, Scale 75 Artist. There are color equivalents out there. Please feel free to look at them. The AK Interactive stuff I've heard nothing but good things about. That was magenta, so that's one of the primary colors we use for color mixing and matching and manipulating. As well as there does exist conversion charts, I believe, on Daka. Okay, orange from Scale 75. Because I knew I wanted to highlight the red with orange notes later on, and I could apply it into the top skin tone. Prussian blue. So Prussian blue and sol yellow, very important colors in my personal mixing palette. Sol yellow to mix with higher value colors to highlight them, to knock off any chalkiness, and the Prussian blue to shade them. So when you look at colors, they have a natural value to them. So the yellow naturally appears brighter than the Prussian blue, even though there's no color in front, even though there's no added white or black. So when highlighting, we can sneak a little bit of yellow in there, and it'll just knock off any chalkiness and give us a much more interesting surface area. Okay, so we've added turquoise, we have added emerald green, and the white is spring green is coming up, and we also have pearl grey on the palette so far. So you can see it runs the gamut here. We have greens, reds, that's vanilla white. Great color, a great color corally. Blah. Need to start that sentence again. If you want to substitute that color, try use ice yellow from Scale 75 from Vallejo. We have burnt sienna, raw umber coming up, which is great for leather effects, mixing into skin tones, and mixing into the base as well. So you have the burnt sienna, which has more of a reddish tone to it, and then the burnt umber, or raw umber rather, just coming along, has more of a greeny base to it. Now we'll be plopping more colours on here, but when constructing a palette, try and do so in this manner. So we have yellow, turquoise and magenta. You can see the triad there. That's not a mistake. We have the sol yellow, Prussian blue, and the red's on the other side. Okay, messed that one a little up. Okay. Okay, let's put the plan into action. Wood grain and sanguine base cover the areas of black that we've left with the pre-coat. The wood grain and the sanguine base cover roughly 50-50. Why am I leaving the white? Well, it gives a stronger impression to any subsequent layers we'll add later on. I'm just building the structure here. Why do I want to build the highlights like this? Well, it's because I want the armor to look lacquered. I don't want it to look dull and matted. Now, a lacquered armor, when light hits its surface, it pings off, it reflects a lot more coherently than, say, the white armor, which will have dust and imperfections. So when light hits it, it scatters everywhere. So that's why when you see... often it's misattributed to non-metallic metal. It isn't. It's just a different style of highlighting. I'm not trying to achieve a non-metallic scheme with this armor. If I were, I'd change the brush strokes. Instead, I want it to appear lacquered. So take note of the style of brush stroke that I employ to get the result that I need. They are coherent, they are consistent with one another, and when I build up the highlights one on top of another, that's when the effect will start to take place. Now this armor, I've been through this once already. It's something that I've done in the Mongol bust tutorial, and I feel like I had a really good grounding when approaching this project through doing that. Now the Mongol bust is a lot more complex in nature, so if you did want to see this style of painting on a bust size miniature that's slightly more involved, slightly more complex, purely because of the size and the scale of the miniature is different, check that out. You can find that by going through a web browser, not through the app on Patreon. Type in Mongol, and the entire series will pop up for you. Okay, orange is mixed into the previous. And you can see that the style of brushstroke I use is consistent. So if you're just having this on in the background, you're not really paying attention, look up and have a look at the style of brushstroke I'm employing here. It's back and forth. It's a feathery light movement with the tip of the brush. The paint is semi-transparent, so the opacity of it is a middle opacity, and it's a middle consistency when it comes to how much moisture is employed. Now, exactly how much is middle, how much is medium? Hopefully, by seeing a video tutorial, you'll be able to gauge somewhat the level of thinness of the paint. However, we are looking at roughly, and this is only ever a rough estimate, these things that I tell you, we are looking at a rough thinness of 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner, there or thereabouts. Have a look at the screen, have a look at the video shot in 4K to make sure that you can see what kind of transitions, what kind of thinness we're using. Okay, let's add a pinch of Nakar in here to begin the highlighting process. And again, you can see the sweep of the brush back and forth to create that faux reflection across the surface. Okay, touch more wood grain is applied. Oh no, it's been a little transition. Okay, let's grab more crimson, add more Bloodfest crimson, and then a pinch of Nakar to create this kind of off pink. Slightly too pink there, so I've added a pinch of orange to warm it up slightly. And how do I know what colours I need in certain areas? Well, patient observation and reflection on what sort of piece I want to create. I looked at lots of different armor plates. I believe it's called Kanto plate? Or no, that's a place in Pokemon, isn't it? No, Karuta, I believe it's pronounced like that. I've only seen it written down. I've never heard it spoken out loud, so it could be completely wrong. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a place in Pokemon. Yeah, Karuta armor. It's made from it's made from a material called lamula, I believe, and it's heavily lacquered, so it's quite dense. It almost looks like a tortoise shell. It's quite dense but lightweight, which really aided, I guess, samurai's way of war, where they used instead of like in the Western tradition where you had big, almost like clubs, given that we didn't have the style of, I don't really know much about this subject, and you can really hear it in my voice, but from what I understand, in the Western tradition, blades, broadswords, axes, they were designed to, if you couldn't get through armor plate, it could certainly break a bone, so it'd bludgeon you to the ground and kill you. However, the Eastern tradition, as I understand it in my very ignorant, myopic worldview, is that they rely much more on slashing motions of cutting and creating lacerations across a person's body. So denseness of armor wasn't needed so much as kind of like knights, which needed big armored plates that if somebody tried to crack you over the head with a mace, you can nut it out of the way. From the Eastern tradition, I'm sure there are weapons that did that. I'm sure of it. Again, this is my very ignorant point of view. And the research I've done is on Wikipedia and The Lost Samurai with Tom Cruise. So please don't hold that against me. But from my limited understanding, this is what I've gleaned from my researchers. Oh God, I've butchered that. You didn't need to know any of that. Me rambling on about my ignorance. But I'm sure there are much more well-informed members of the community, and if you'd like to point me straight, please put in the comments below this video. But I do like that film despite myself. I do like The Last Samurai. I'm a Tom Cruise fan. I know he's crazy, but crazy people can be talented as well. He's very watchable. Oh, this is making so much more sense to me now. The red armor I've employed here it's his armor in The Last Samurai. Okay, so we've created the... Okay, back to painting. We've created the basis. We have created the structure of the piece. From here, we add intermediary glazes. So the glazing here is a medium glaze. I'm very sorry for not defining these terms further. However, we can have... Let's split it into roughly thirds, right? We have a heavy glaze, which has a lot of pigmentation to it and affects the underlying layer strongly. A medium glaze, which does affect it but semi-opaque. And then a thin glaze, which completely and utterly... It almost looks like dirty water. So intermediary glazes are added in between the layers we've put down to create a blended surface. Now this does leave a really nice transition surface, but it does look quite boring. So in order to zhuzh it up a little bit, in order to sex it up a little bit, we need to add a lighter color. So this is created with sol yellow and the previous mixture of vanilla white and orange. The tip of the brush is used in light feathery motions back and forth to develop that kind of like wavy point of light, that wavy light running down the side of the armor plate. And you can see the brushstroke, it's quite, I don't want to say dreamlike, it makes me sound ponderous saying that, or inexact, but it's a wave-like pattern. It's quite a relaxed pattern back and forth. It's almost like I'm trying to make little N's. So the letter N, again and again and again. So drag it along the edge. You can see it's a really light, it's almost like a very light skin tone I'm using here. So light flesh from Vallejo would be appropriate to use instead if you didn't like colour mixing and matching and didn't like colour blending. Which is a shame if you don't like that. But, please try and develop that aspect of your art because it's so rewarding. Okay, the edge of the armor. I'm primarily trying to pick out the edges of the armor to begin with, and then I'm trying to paint those little N's again and again and again. I hope so it's the letter N. I'm not sure whether my accent is butchering it or it's coming through inexact. I have a little bit of a cold at the moment, so apologies if my voice sounds a little nasally. Blasted myself with Otrivine, which is kind of like a nasal spray in this country, in the UK. Okay, more little N's. Okay, the side panels. Pay attention to where I hit them, because light, or the most amount of light, will hit those areas first, because the line of the armor sits underneath his arm in that instance. Okay, let's mix up. So I've included a little bit more red in this mixture. I didn't want it as bright. I didn't want it as high a value a colour on this reflection as the first one. So this is my secondary highlight. The primary highlight has the, I guess, the primary light source hitting it. It develops into its darkest shade and then has a bounce reflection, so it reflects the ambient surroundings. So even though we're highlighting the armor plate twice, we have relied on our execution of value and understanding of value to give it more contrast. So the first highlight has a higher value, has a brighter colour to it, whereas this colour has a slightly lower value but much more saturation to it. And let me know if these terms are clear. I try and introduce them in every single video, but I don't want to sound annoying trying to tell you this stuff. I don't want to feel like I'm trying to sell you snake oil by telling you this stuff. But okay, color, it's a simple formula. So we have value, hue, saturation, and chromatic value. That's the formula. It doesn't change. It doesn't change whatsoever. We have value, the scale from black to white. Hue, simply the color, red, blue, yellow. Saturation, how intense that color is. The red, for example, you can see on screen is quite a desaturated color because there's quite a lot of brown in there. When you contrast it with the crimson that you can see on the other side of the screen, saturated color. His armor, his Karuta armor, desaturated. Then we have chromatic value. So when we look at colors, some appear brighter than others. You look at Sol Yellow, that naturally appears brighter than the orange next to it. So the formula does not change whatsoever. You plug in different colors, you plug in different things into that formula, you'll spit out different results. In this case, because it's a Horus Heresy miniature, okay, let's go through this. Values. No matter what miniature you paint, you'll have a variety of values. You do want to express a variety to give you maximum contrast. The armor plate, his Karuta armor, I'm getting the hang of this now, has a higher value scale than the white armor, so we can say that it has a lacquered appearance. The cloth will not have as high a value contrast when highlighting and shading it. It simply won't, because that's not how that material works. It's not how the cloth reflects light. When you do non-metallic, you want a high value contrast from black to white to give the impression of light running across a shiny surface. Okay, so value. You have hue, color choice. It's a big thing. I wanted to use, for the white, I wanted an interesting white running that mid-tone. It's not particularly blue, it's not particularly white. It has warm elements contrasted with cool elements to it. The red, much better example, much easier example to explain. I could have used a really bright saturated red, like you normally see 40k, or how you used to see them, almost like a red-orange. By choosing to use brown instead, mentally I'm locating that image as more of a earthy warrior, somebody who rides horses, somebody who has dirt on him. All these things I'm suggesting in my color choice, that I'm grounding the work in reality. I'm grounding the work in some semblance of a reality. I'm suggesting things like leather, things that you'd normally associate maybe like a Mongolian warrior thrown over his horse, like this rich reddish leather appearance. The golds I'll be using later on are muted. They're almost bronze, because until, again, I'm showing my ignorance here, but until the Mongolian Empire took over places like invaded places like China and stole shit from other different civilizations, they didn't have much luck, or I don't believe that they had much of a gold smelting society. They were mainly raiders, right? So my choice of not having a pure gold reflects that this isn't a legion of pomp. This isn't the third legion. This is a more grounded legion. The green of his tabard, the green of his tabard contrasts against the red. So it's a color choice made consciously, in part as a reflection of the red armor that we have on here. We'll also be shading the golds with red. We'll even be shading the metallics with red later on. So hue, color choice, informed what this work is, or what it will become. Okay, so value, hue, saturation. You want a good variety of saturations. If everything was dull and muted, say if you... perfect example. Have a look at the Death Corpse of Krieg that I painted. Very low saturated miniatures to give a really dull, dreary... It almost looks like a black and white photo that's been corrupted with greens. That's the kind of impression, that's the vibe I wanted to go for with them. With this piece, I can include a variety of different saturations. You'll see later on in the armor plate, we'll be using red ink to saturate it, as well as blood on the base and on the sword itself. So there's a good variety of different saturations applied to this miniature. And then chromatic value, that's mainly in my choice of color mixing. When I highlight a piece, like we see here, we've used vanilla white. We aren't using pure white. At no point in this project, even the armor plate, there is no pure white existing on this miniature. It's always corrupted by another color. There's always some influence from the surrounding ambience. That's what I've done here. So instead of using pure white and ending up with a slightly chalky appearance to the armor, I've employed vanilla white, which is a high value, so it's a light bone color. I hope that makes sense. I hope I haven't derailed things too much. If you have any questions, please put them in the Patreon comments below, because I'm looking to incorporate questions asked in the Patreon at the end of videos. If you have any questions whatsoever about the painting process of Qin Xa or anything, let me know. I will answer it at the end of, and this is open to anybody on the Patreon from $1 to $200. You ask, I'll put a Q&A session at the end of the video, but you need to ask. Okay. The paint at this point is quite thick, so it's near enough 3 parts paint to 1 part thinner. I'm just relying on the natural moisture on the brush, or in the bristles of the brush itself. The tip of the brush, these fine feathery motions, are just picking up on the edges of the armor plate. And again, the armor at this point, it looks slightly, oh there you go, I've anticipated my own thing. Yeah, it looks too out of whack, it's too bright, the coloration isn't very good, so we use red ink. Why do we use red ink? To up the saturation. Now previously Games Workshop, the way they like to sell red inks is that it acted as a shade. So you'd have dark inks to shade everything. But in my process, I enjoy using to punch up the strength of the colours. So red ink in this case from scale 75. I have used Dale Aroundy and Winsor & Newton in the past, however students have complained that they're having issues with bleed through, so I'll try and use, where possible, materials that are easily available and that are made for miniature painting. So red ink by scale 75. You can also find, I believe it's Crimson by Vallejo. Excellent paints, and this is being dragged over the highlight, so even though the highlight does receive a sweep of colour, it isn't allowed to linger. I'm dragging my brush over that highlight into the mid-tone right the way through to the shadow. You can see by my style of brushstroke and my choice of brushstroke, I can push it right the way over. I can add a very thin film of paint over the highlight to homogenize it, and then unite everything together. Okay, one of my favourite things to do, not only with faces, not only with non-metallics, but with Karuta armour as well. We had a pinch of turquoise with some vanilla white and pure white to create this light off green colour. Now I've gone down to a 00 paintbrush. The paint is quite thick, 3 parts paint to 1 part thinner. I'm only relying on the natural moisture of the brush. I'm adding these little N's. Again, this is my specular highlight. So a specular highlight simply means the brightest pinprick of paint. And I'm not trying to blend this in with the underlying layers whatsoever. You need it to stand apart from what we've done previously. You need it to stand really strong against the background. I'm sorry, my camera does fade in and out of focus here. It's quite annoying, but we only want to overlap this on the very top portions of the highlight. And that's what will sell the effect of it being a lacquered armor plate. If this were a dull plate, say like the white, the ivory of his armor plate, it will not have this kind of warm to cool contrast to it. Okie dokie. Red ink is applied to the side portions of his Karuta plate, and I also throw in a little bit of orange as well and use it as a glaze to help tie everything together. I'm using I'm using a combination of Rosemary & Co and Winsor & Newton Series 7 brushes. They are both Kolinsky Sable Hair. The Rosemary & Co is a UK manufacturer. They for what you get is surprisingly good value for the brushes. I normally buy a couple of Winsor & Newtons as my grade A brushes, and then I will add maybe 5 or 6 Rosemary & Co brushes. At the beginning they give a very similar feel, but the Rosemary & Co don't last as long as the Winsor & Newton. But then again, I've had them for around 2 years, so I don't know, and these go through hard usage as well, so I'm not sure if they ship internationally. I hope they do, because they're wonderful brushes. I've heard good things about the Da Vinci's, never tried them. I've tried the Broken Toad brushes, superb set of brushes. Can't say enough good things about them. Da Vinci's I've used here. Raphael 844, superb. I'd be a little bit distrustful of other paint brush manufacturers. But then again, I haven't tried them all. So what do I know? On to the skin tone. We begin by mixing together pink flesh, sanguine base, and a pinch of emerald green. If you don't want to go through this arcane process, you do not need to. You just need to take something like rose brown from Vallejo model color. The only reason why I've done it is that the colours are there. I wanted to desaturate the skin ever so slightly and add a pinch of darkness to it. So the sanguine base off the darkness, the green desaturated ever so slightly. Okay, to begin the skin tone, I start by adding dots of pink flesh to the very top portions of the head. I'm not worried whatsoever about the blend at this point. It's only marking in the structure of the face. The paint is quite thick, 2 to 3 parts paint to 1 part thinner, and the moisture in the brush should allow it to carry off onto the miniature. So we're looking to highlight everything from the mid-tone right the way through to the highlight. We leave the lower mid-tone and lower mid-tones and shadows alone. Okay, let's take a bit more green flesh. We've added a pinch more emerald green into the mixture to create this undead skin tone for the character down below. This poor guy dragging himself out of a dreadnought. Now, I'm not too concerned about the coloration of this guy so far because I will be painting it with oils later on in the process. I'll be talking about how we can use oils to add blending, add seamless blends to our work. So a couple of coats should do the job. Okay, golden skin and sol yellow are added to the pink flesh plus red and green mixture. You can see it's a very, very virulent yellow. And I apply this in a dotting technique. So again, pointillism, building the structure on the very top of his head. All structure at this point. Whenever we start a paint job, values and volumes. And when it dries, it doesn't look anywhere near as aggressive as it does when it goes on. This is then applied to the very top of the head again, the top of his frown lines, and the top of his cheeks. It's all the areas we want to hit with that slight amount of yellow. If you did want to learn more about the color zones of the face, please refer to the Mongol tutorial and the PDF. There's also a short part of it in the Sanguinius PDF tutorial as well. See my brush strokes that I'm not moving it around that much. It's only using the tip of the brush to establish structure. I'm using the brush to stab at the miniature more. And this comes about because he has a domed head. There's no hair to build a highlight towards. So if you're working on any domed surfaces like that, shoulder pads for example, start your brush stroke at the apex of the highlight. Use dots to establish the structure, and you can add glazes over the top to help blend it together. Okay, wood grain and crimson. We are looking at a roughly 50-50 split, and we're using a very thin glaze consistency. So this, a student coined it as a believe layer. And before the paint dries, I'm going to add golden skin as a very light glaze over the top of the head. to help unify everything, to help put it all together. To add more dynamism and specificity to the skin tone, I return to the Sol Yellow and add a pinch of golden skin into it. Very, very slight amount. Okay, a small amount of magenta is applied around the rim of the head and around the underside of his cheek. That should help blend everything together and give a lot more punch to the skin tones built up so far. We had a glazed layer of burnt umber, burnt sienna rather, and magenta. This is mashed into the skin to give it a slightly darker overall appearance to start building the oil glazes on top of. And that is it for part 1. Join us in part 2 when we'll be exploring how to bring all this together with weathering, detailing, oils, and I think a technique we haven't covered so far with oil blending. Catch you in the next vid.